The neighborhood had always seemed deceptively peaceful. A small suburban community tucked behind manicured hedges and stone walls that made it look more exclusive than it truly was. The houses weren't mansions, but they carried themselves, with a sort of pride-painted fences, neatly trimmed lawns, and little seasonal flags fluttering on porches. On the surface, it was the kind of place where nothing dramatic should ever happen, but under that glossy exterior lay a simmering world of rules, appearances, and people who lived for confrontation. For weeks, there had been whispers about a man patrolling the streets. He wasn't dressed like the police exactly, but he wore a dark uniform-style outfit, complete with a badge-shaped patch on the shoulder. Sometimes he drove slowly down the cul-de-sacs in an old Crown Victoria, lights mounted on the dashboard, as if he were watching over the community. To anyone passing by, he might have looked legitimate, but to those who paid closer attention, the details didn't quite line up. The patches were vague. The car was far too old and dented, and the authority he carried was more bluster than law. The residents started calling him the HOA cop. He claimed to be an enforcer, someone who worked directly with the homeowners association to keep the neighborhood in order. He barked at kids for leaving bikes in driveways, made notes about who left their trash bins out too long, and even threatened fines for people who had weeds sprouting through their sidewalk cracks. The truth, however, was far stranger. He wasn't an HOA employee, nor was he affiliated with law enforcement. He was just a neighbor with too much time on his hands and a dangerous obsession with control. The narrator of this story, a homeowner who had lived there for just under a year, had been watching all of this unfold with mild irritation. Like most new residents, they had moved into the neighborhood for peace, privacy, and a sense of safety. But what they got instead was an unwanted watchdog who believed he was judge, jury, and executioner of suburban living standards. The man seemed particularly fixated on cars, criticizing anyone who parked on the street instead of in their driveway, peering into windshields, and sometimes even scribbling notes on scraps of paper before tucking them under wipers. At first it was easy to ignore. The HOA cop was more of a nuisance than a threat, an eccentric neighbor with a delusional sense of power. But then, one night, things took a much darker turn. The narrator's car was their Prida, modest but well-kept sedan, parked neatly in front of their home. It wasn't flashy, but it was clean, cared for, and dependable. That evening, they returned home after a long day, only to find the front bumper dented, the side mirror hanging loosely by wires, and long, jagged scratches running down the driver's side door. At first, it looked like a hit-and-run, but as they examined the damage closer, a different picture began to form. On the hood of the car, smeared in thick black marker, were the words, "No street parking." The message was unmistakable, the handwriting crude, and the rage behind it undeniable. Someone hadn't just damaged the car, they had made a statement. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sight of the damaged vehicle. Some whispered quietly, others shook their heads in disapproval. But everyone seemed to share the same suspicion. The HOA cop had finally crossed the line. He had been grumbling about street parking for months, claiming it ruined the aesthetic of the neighborhood. He had left fake tickets before, threatening to tow cars despite having no legal right to do so. Now, it seemed, he had escalated from petty intimidation to outright vandalism. The narrator felt a mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't just about the Corrit, it was about being targeted, violated, and humiliated in their own neighborhood. They had paid good money to live there, followed the actual HOA rules to the letter, and yet they were now the victim of someone's personal vendetta. And as the crowd around them grew, murmurs turned into suggestions. Some said to call the police, others warned that the HOA cop would deny everything. After all, without proof, it would just be one person's word against another's. That night, the narrator made a decision. They weren't going to let this go. They weren't going to be another neighbor who grumbled about the HOA cop behind closed doors but did nothing. They were going to gather evidence, expose him, and make sure the entire neighborhood saw him for what he truly was, as the damaged car sat parked in front of their home, a symbol of both defiance and violation. A plan began to form. Security cameras would be installed. Every movement on the street would be recorded, and if the HOA cop came back, there would be no denying it. But the narrator didn't realize just how far the man was willing to go to protect his fake authority. This wasn't just about a dented car or a vandalized hood. This was about power, ego, and obsession. and once the first line had been crossed, there was no going back. The following days would reveal a tangled web of lies, intimidation, and shocking truths. Neighbors would be forced to pick sides. The HOA itself would be drawn into the chaos, and the HOA cop, who had thrived on fear and compliance, would finally face consequences he had never imagined. For now, though, the night was heavy with tension. The sound of crickets filled the air as the narrator looked one last time at the words scrawled on their car, "No street parking." It was more than graffiti, it was a declaration of war, and war was exactly what was coming. Traps, cameras, and a neighborhood on edge. The days following the car vandalism were filled with a tense quiet, the kind of silence that weighs on the air before a storm breaks. The narrator went about their routine, but every movement in the neighborhood felt charged with suspicion. The once friendly street now seemed divided, each neighbor glancing out their windows with narrowed eyes, wondering who would be next to cross the self-proclaimed HOA cop. The decision to install cameras came swiftly. By the following evening, small security devices were discreetly mounted above the garage, at the corners of the house, and even tucked beneath the porch light, their lenses hidden yet all-seeing. The narrator didn't announce it to anyone, but word travels fast in small communities. Neighbors whispered about it during morning walks, and some quietly admitted they were relieved. Finally, someone was doing what everyone else had been too afraid to attempt, fighting back. Still, there were warnings too. One elderly resident, known for keeping to herself, shuffled over one morning and muttered that the HOA cop didn't take kindly to being challenged. She recounted how he had once harassed a teenager for playing music too loud, following him home and pounding on his parents' door until the boy was forbidden from using speakers outdoors ever again. If he felt cornered, she warned, he might lash out in unpredictable ways. The narrator listened politely, but inwardly, they were resolute. Enough was enough. Fear had kept the neighborhood in check for too long, and that fear had emboldened the man to escalate his behavior unchecked. The cameras weren't just protection, they were a spotlight, ready to expose his lies and his delusions of authority. The first few days of footage showed nothing unusual. Cars came and went, kids rode their bikes, delivery trucks rattled down the street. The HOA cop was seen occasionally, pacing the sidewalks in his dark quizzy uniform, scribbling in a notebook, glaring at parked vehicles as if cataloging crimes. But he kept his distance from the narrator's property, perhaps aware that too many eyes were on him after the vandalism incident. Then, on the fourth night, something changed. At around 2 a.m, the cameras captured movement. The grainy image of the Crown Victoria rolled slowly into frame, headlights dimmed, crawling past the narrator's driveway. The car paused, engine idling, before moving on. It happened again the next night, and the night after that, always slow, always watching. The narrator began to feel the pressure. It wasn't direct confrontation, but it was psychological warfare, a reminder that he was still out there, circling, observing, waiting for an opportunity. The paranoia started to seep in. Every late-night creak of the house sounded suspicious. Every shadow at the edge of the street felt threatening. And yet, despite the unease, the narrator knew the footage was gold. Proof of surveillance, of harassment, of intent. But the real breakthrough came one weekend afternoon. The narrator returned from errands to find a bright orange slip tucked under their windshield wiper. It was styled to look like an official parking violation, complete with block lettering and a fake seal at the top. It declared that street parking was prohibited, that fines of up to $500 would be imposed for continued violations, and that vehicles may be removed at owner's expense. The cameras caught the entire act. The HOA cop, striding up the driveway with false authority, slapping the notice onto the windshield, and then retreating quickly to his car. His face was clear, his actions undeniable. It was the kind of evidence that could tear apart the carefully constructed illusion he had built around himself. But rather than confront him immediately, the narrator decided to wait. They wanted to see just how far he would go, to let him dig the hole deeper before presenting the shovel he had used. And sure enough, he did not disappoint. Over the next week, more violations appeared on the car, each more aggressive than the last. One accused the narrator of endangering children by forcing them to walk around a parked vehicle. Another threatened legal action. The handwriting was always the same crude scrawl, and the fake seals became sloppier, as if rushed in anger. The man was unraveling, and the cameras documented every second of it. By now, the neighborhood was buzzing. Some residents started approaching the narrator, asking if they too could place cameras on their properties. Others admitted privately that they had been victims as well. Notes slipped under doors, threats about property values, even unannounced inspections where the man had strutted into backyards, claiming to check for compliance. Most had stayed quiet out of fear or embarrassment, but the narrator's defiance seemed to spark something new in them. The tipping point came one humid evening. The narrator returned home to find the car once again vandalized. This time, the tires were slashed, each one flattened deliberately. Spray painted across the driver's side in bold red letters was a single word: move. It was a blatant act of violence, far beyond petty notes or intimidation, and it was all captured on camera. His face, his actions, his rage. The narrator stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling in. This was no longer just about their car, or even about themselves. This was about a man who had declared war on his entire neighborhood, who had hidden behind a mask of authority for too long. And now, thanks to the evidence, that mask was ready to be torn away. As neighbors gathered once again to stare at the damage, whispers turned into outrage. Some spoke of calling the police immediately, while others worried about retaliation. But one thing was certain: the HOA cop was running out of time, and his reign of intimidation was coming to an end. The narrator knew the next step would be crucial. Evidence needed to be presented, not just to the police, but to the homeowners association itself. The community had to see the truth with their own eyes, and once they did, there would be no going back. What none of them realized, however, was that the HOA cop had his own plans. He wasn't about to surrender quietly, and the confrontation that was coming would shake the neighborhood to its core. The evidence and the HOA's silence, the slashed tires, were still fresh in everyone's mind when the narrator took the next step. The cameras had done their job: multiple angles, clear audio, and unmistakable footage of the HOA cop himself committing vandalism in the dead of night. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. On a bright Monday morning, the narrator organized everything into a neat digital folder: timestamps, clips, and still images pulled from the recordings. The plan was simple: present the evidence to both the police and the homeowners association. If the HOA had allowed this man to posture as their enforcer for so long, then surely, faced with undeniable proof, they would act swiftly to remove him from any position of influence, real or imagined. The visit to the police station was straightforward. An officer reviewed the footage, raised an eyebrow at the spray-painted move across the car door, and nodded gravely at the slashed tires. Vandalism, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement. Each clip layered another crime onto the pile. A report was filed, statements taken, and promises made. The officer explained that a warrant would likely follow, but there was a hesitation too, a kind of bureaucratic slowness, as though the gears of justice were grinding in their own time. The narrator didn't want to wait. The neighborhood couldn't afford to. So, later that evening, they attended the monthly HOA meeting, USB drive in hand. It was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Normally, these meetings drew sparse attendance: 10 or 12 residents at most, complaining about landscaping budgets or pool hours. But word of the recent vandalism had spread, and this time, the room was full. At the front sat the board, 3 middle-aged homeowners with clipboards, none of them paid, all of them volunteers who had taken on the thankless job of managing the community. Their expressions were stiff as the narrator approached, evidence in hand, the room buzzing with anticipation. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The man's facade was about to crumble. The footage played on the clubhouse projector, the room falling into stunned silence as the grainy images flickered across the wall. There he was, striding across driveways, slipping fake tickets under wipers, slashing tires, and spray-painting threats with wild, angry strokes. Gasps echoed from the crowd, followed by murmurs of recognition. Neighbors pointed, whispered, nodded. They had all seen him. They all knew him. But now there was no denying what he had done. And then, something unexpected happened. The HOA board didn't explode with outrage. They didn't vow immediate action. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances, whispered quietly among themselves, and finally, the president cleared her throat. She thanked the narrator for bringing the evidence forward, acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, and then announced that the board would review the matter privately before making any decisions. The room erupted. Residents shouted from their seats, demanding answers, demanding accountability. One man stood up and yelled that his garden hose had been cut weeks earlier, and he now realized who was responsible. A woman claimed the HOA cop had trespassed into her yard, measuring her fence without permission. The air grew hot with anger and betrayal, but the board remained firm. The issue, they said, required further discussion. The narrator couldn't believe it. The evidence was overwhelming. The man wasn't an enforcer, he wasn't authorized, he was a fraud and a criminal. And yet, the HOA hesitated. Why? The answer came in hushed whispers after the meeting ended. A neighbor pulled the narrator aside, eyes darting nervously, and revealed the truth. The HOA cop was related to one of the board members, a brother-in-law to be exact. He had been meddling for years, but whenever complaints reached the board, they were quietly brushed aside. What everyone assumed was tolerance or fear was, in fact, favoritism. The man's false authority had been shielded by family ties. The realization spread quickly. The board wasn't neutral, they were complicit. By refusing to act, they had allowed his behavior to escalate unchecked, and now the entire neighborhood was paying the price. Meanwhile, the HOA cop himself seemed emboldened. Perhaps he had heard whispers of the meeting, or perhaps he simply felt untouchable. Either way, his presence grew more aggressive in the days that followed. He prowled the sidewalks with a flashlight at night, glaring up at windows, as if daring residents to confront him. He left more fake tickets, not just on the narrator's car, but on several others. One was slapped onto a minivan belonging to a young family, accusing them of excessive driveway clutter. Another targeted an elderly couple, citing unauthorized decorations. Each slip of paper carried the same message: he was in charge, and no one could stop him. The neighborhood was reaching a boiling point. Divisions formed quickly. Some residents, fearful of retaliation, urged patience. Let the police handle it, they said. Others demanded immediate action, furious at the HOA's inaction and the brazen escalation of the HOA cops' tactics. Tension turned neighbors against one another, and the quiet streets began to feel less like a community and more like a battlefield. Through it all, the narrator remained focused. The evidence was too strong to ignore, and while the HOA dragged its feet, the legal process was moving forward. It was only a matter of time before the police acted. The narrator installed even more cameras, ensuring every angle was covered, every shadow documented. If the man tried anything again, there would be no escape. And then, one night, he did. The cameras caught him creeping across the lawn, closer than ever before. He wasn't vandalizing this time. He wasn't leaving notes. He was peering into windows, flashlight beam cutting across the living room, the unmistakable outline of his face illuminated by the glow. He lingered there, watching, as though searching for something or someone. It was no longer about cars, no longer about rules. This had become personal. And the narrator knew, with chilling certainty, that the confrontation everyone had been dreading was now inevitable. The breaking point. That footage of the HOA cop peering into windows changed everything. Until then, his actions could be written off, however wrongly, as obsessive enforcement of rules, vandalism, harassment, intimidation, serious crimes. Yes, but all framed around his delusional notion of being the neighborhood's protector. But looking into windows at night was different. It was invasive, predatory, and deeply unsettling. It suggested motives that went beyond obsession with cars and parking spaces. It suggested danger. The narrator shared the latest footage with the neighbors who had already voiced concerns, and the reaction was swift. Fear turned into fury. The idea that he might be spying into homes, possibly watching children, set the community ablaze with outrage. Residents who had once stayed silent now came forward with stories of their own footsteps outside their windows at night, flashlights sweeping across their yards, strange knocks on their doors with no one standing there when they answered. Suddenly, the pattern was clear. This wasn't new behavior. It had been happening for months, maybe longer, but nobody had ever pieced it together until now. The narrator knew that waiting for the HOA or the police to solve the problem was no longer enough. The neighborhood itself needed to take a stand. So, they called for a community meeting, not under the HOA's authority, but outside of it. Flyers were slipped under doors, emails sent, Word of mouth spread like wildfire. The meeting would be held in the park at the center of the neighborhood, away from the clubhouse, away from the board. It would be residents only, no excuses, no interference. The turnout was staggering. Nearly every household sent someone, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere wasn't hushed or fearful, it was charged with determination. The narrator stood before them, laptop balanced on a picnic table, and played the footage once. More gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by angry shouts. A father clenched his fists as he watched the man's flashlight beam cross his children's bedroom window. A mother shook her head in disbelief, muttering that she'd reported strange noises weeks ago and been dismissed by the board. When the footage ended, there was no debate. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. Enough was enough. Plans began forming right there in the park. Some suggested pooling money for private security. Others wanted to file a collective lawsuit against the HOA for negligence. A few even muttered about confronting the HOA cop directly, though voices urged caution. In the end, the consensus was clear. The man had to be stopped, and the community wasn't going to wait quietly anymore. Meanwhile, the narrator kept feeding footage to the police, who confirmed that charges were pending. But legal wheels turned, slowly, and the man seemed to sense that his time was running out. His behavior became more erratic, more reckless. He abandoned the pretense of official-looking uniforms, now stomping around in camouflage gear, flashlight strapped to his chest like a soldier on patrol. He barked at neighbors openly in the street, accusing them of endangering property values or compromising safety. His Crown Victoria circled the blocks at all hours, headlights cutting through windows long after midnight. And then came the night that pushed everything past the point of no return. It was a Friday evening, warm and buzzing with weekend energy. Families gathered on porches, children played in driveways, and laughter filled the air. The narrator was inside reviewing security footage when the sound of shouting erupted outside. Rushing to the window, they saw the HOA cop standing in the middle of the street, red-faced and raging, holding a stack of his fake violation notices. He was screaming at a family who had dared to park 2 cars in their driveway, one of them sticking slightly onto the sidewalk. Neighbors began spilling out of their homes, forming a circle around the confrontation. Phones were raised, cameras recording, voices shouting back at him. The man's face twisted in fury as he waved his papers, declaring fines, threatening to tow vehicles, insisting he had the authority to act. But this time, nobody backed down. The entire neighborhood was watching, united, no longer willing to tolerate his delusions. The narrator stepped forward with their phone, playing the damning footage on speaker. The sound of tires being slashed, the hiss of escaping air, the spray of paint hitting metal that filled the street. The crowd gasped, and all eyes turned to the HOA cop. His expression faltered for the first time, his voice catching in his throat as the reality of exposure hit him. But then, instead of retreating, he doubled down. He threw the stack of notices into the air, papers fluttering like confetti in the street, and roared that everyone was against him, that the neighborhood was falling apart because nobody respected rules, and that he was the only one strong enough to keep it from collapsing into chaos. His rant spiraled into incoherent shouts, his hands shaking, sweat dripping down his face. Children cried, parents pulled them back, and neighbors filmed every second. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, flashing blue lights appeared at the end of the street. A police cruiser rolled in, siren wailing briefly before cutting off. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, scanning the chaotic scene. The crowd parted, all eyes on the man who had terrorized them for months. The HOA cop froze, his bluster collapsing in the face of real authority. He tried to argue, pointing at cars, waving his arms, but the officers ignored his ranting. They walked straight to the narrator, who handed over the USB drive with all the footage. Within minutes, the officers turned to the man, handcuffed him, without ceremony, and led him toward the cruiser. The crowd erupted into cheers, relief pouring through the street like a long-awaited rainstorm after a drought. But even as he was shoved into the back of the car, the man shouted through the open window, his voice cracked, desperate, but filled with venom. He swore that it wasn't over, that they would all regret turning against him, that they had no idea who they were dealing with. The cruiser door slammed, muffling his words, and then the car drove away, taillights disappearing into the night. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence. The nightmare seemed to be over, but his final words lingered like a shadow. What did he mean? What else was he hiding? The narrator couldn't shake the feeling that, even in handcuffs, the HOA cop wasn't finished. And soon, they would find out just how right that feeling was. Secrets, lies, and the past uncovered the night of the arrest should have marked the end. For the first time in months, the streets were quiet, the air free of his prowling headlights and heavy footsteps. Neighbors walked dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Children played late into the evening, and porch conversations carried the relieved laughter of people who felt safe again. But beneath the calm unease lingered. His last words, shouted from the back of the police cruiser, clung to everyone like a bitter aftertaste. You don't know who you're dealing with. The narrator tried to move on, but the cameras kept running, their quiet red lights blinking in the night like watchful eyes. It was a precaution, a habit now, and it gave them comfort. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man's rage, his sense of authority, his obsession with control, those weren't things that disappeared with a pair of handcuffs. They were the kind of traits that clung, that festered, that came back stronger if left unchecked. Within days, the rumors began. Some claimed he'd been released on bail. Others said the charges wouldn't stick, that vandalism and harassment weren't enough to keep him behind bars. A few whispered darker theories, that he had connections, that the police hadn't taken everything seriously, that he would return sooner than anyone expected. The uncertainty gnawed at the neighborhood. Then came the revelations. One curious neighbor, a retired teacher with a knack for digging through public records, decided to do some research. She started with property files, then court databases, then old newspaper clippings. What she uncovered sent shockwaves through the community. The HOA cop wasn't just a meddlesome neighbor, he had a history. Years earlier, in another town, just 2 hours away, he had been caught impersonating law enforcement. Back then, he had even purchased fake police gear online, mounting lights on his car, flashing badges at unsuspecting drivers. He had been fined, briefly jailed, and then disappeared. No one had known where he'd gone, until now. But the most damning discovery was his connection to the HOA board. It wasn't just that he was a brother-in-law to one of the members. Digging deeper, the retired teacher uncovered emails, old meeting notes, and suspicious expense reports. It turned out that the board had been quietly reimbursing him for neighborhood security, funneling HOA funds into his pocket under the guise of safety patrol. For years, residents had unknowingly been paying him to harass them. The news spread like wildfire. The community, once timid and divided, now felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The HOA board, caught in a storm of accusations, scrambled to defend themselves. They claimed ignorance, insisting they thought he was simply volunteering his time and that any reimbursements were minor. But the evidence suggested otherwise. They had known. They had enabled him, and worst of all, they had silenced complaints. To protect their own reputation, the narrator watched the neighborhood unravel in real time. Emergency meetings were called, petitions circulated, and residents demanded the board's resignation. Voices that had once trembled with fear now roared with fury. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a system of neglect and corruption that had let him thrive. Meanwhile, the man himself remained a looming shadow. Though arrested, he had already been released pending trial. Sightings trickled in. Someone claimed to have seen his Crown Victoria parked near the highway. Another swore he had driven past the neighborhood late at night, headlights off. Whether true or not, the stories spread panic. The cameras captured nothing definitive, but that didn't matter. His presence was felt even in absence. And then, one night, proof returned. At 3 in the morning, one of the cameras caught movement. Again, a figure darting across the yard, this time hooded, careful, but unmistakably him. He didn't vandalize. He didn't leave notes. He simply stood there, staring up at the house for several long minutes, before vanishing into the darkness. It was as if he wanted them to know he was still out there, watching, waiting. The narrator shared the footage with the police, who promised to look into it, but the response felt hollow. The neighbors were furious. They had evidence. They had a pattern, and yet, nothing seemed to keep him away. The HOA scandal worsened in the meantime. 2 board members resigned under pressure, leaving one still clinging to her position, the one related to him. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, that family ties had nothing to do with her decisions. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it. Residents organized protests outside the clubhouse, waving signs demanding her resignation. Meetings turned hostile, voices shouting, security called. The once orderly suburban community was now a battlefield. Through it all, the narrator stayed vigilant. The cameras never stopped recording, and the car, once vandalized, now sat repaired but never unwatched. They had become the symbol of resistance, the one neighbor who had stood up when everyone else stayed silent. But with that role came risk. He wasn't just haunting the neighborhood anymore, he was haunting them specifically. The breaking point loomed again. The evidence had exposed him. The community had turned against the board, and the police were circling closer to filing stronger charges. But he wasn't finished. His obsession with control, his need for power, had turned into desperation, and desperate people do reckless things. The neighborhood had seen vandalism, intimidation, and surveillance. But what was coming next would shake them to their core. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for months reached its peak one sweltering summer night. The streets, once lined with laughter and casual conversation, now held an uneasy stillness. Every porch light burned bright, every window was carefully shut, and every resident seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the inevitable return of the man who had terrorized them for so long. The narrator, ever vigilant, stayed awake past midnight, reviewing security camera feeds and making notes. Each clip, each movement, each shadow was scrutinized. They had already alerted the police to the recent sighting, the hooded figure in the yard, but as always, the response was slow. The officers promised to investigate, but in the meantime, the neighborhood itself had become the frontline dot. At around 2:17 a.m., the first signs appeared. The familiar headlights of the Crown Victoria cut through the darkness, slow and deliberate, making its rounds. But this time, the man wasn't alone. Inside the car, a second figure could be glimpsed, someone assisting him, someone willing to escalate his reign of intimidation. The narrator's pulse quickened. They had anticipated his return, but this level of brazenness suggested desperation. The car stopped near the narrator's driveway. The man stepped out, flashlight in hand, moving carefully but confidently, like he owned the street. The crowd of neighbors, now quietly assembled in the shadows behind fences and parked cars, remained hidden, ready to act if necessary. Months of fear had been replaced by planning, coordination, and resolve. The narrator switched on an external spotlight, illuminating the yard. The figure froze, caught in the beam. A phone camera followed, recording every movement. Every step he took was now documented, every gesture captured for evidence that would be undeniable. For a tense moment, time seemed to stretch. The man scanned the yard, seemingly aware that he had been spotted. His posture shifted, the confident swagger replaced by hesitation. Then came a sound that had haunted the neighborhood for weeks, the scraping of metal. He approached the front of the car, tools in hand, ready to repeat the vandalism of months past. But the narrator was ready. With one swift motion, the security lights blazed, cameras recording, and the neighbors stepped forward from their hiding spots. Dozens of people emerged, shouting, calling for him to stop, some even blocking the path to the car. He hesitated, frozen between anger and fear, realizing that the entire neighborhood had turned against him. At that exact moment, the sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. The police, finally acting on the accumulated evidence and tips, arrived in force. The cruiser lights flashed, blue and red illuminating the cul-de-sac. Officers poured out, positioning themselves around the man and his accomplice. There was no escape this time. He tried to shout, to assert control, but the words faltered. For the first time, the illusion of power crumbled completely. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, his accomplice subdued, and the car, once a target of his rage, remained unscathed. The neighbors watched in silent triumph, the months of terror finally ending with an undeniable resolution. In the days that followed, the HOA board faced further scrutiny. The member who had shielded him resigned under pressure, and the remaining members were forced to implement strict oversight and transparency measures. The neighborhood, while still scarred by months of fear and harassment, began to rebuild its trust and sense of community. The narrator, though exhausted from the months of tension, became a quiet hero. Their vigilance, foresight, and courage had exposed not only a criminal but also a system that enabled him. The repaired car, once vandalized and slashed, became a symbol of resilience, parked proudly in the driveway. A reminder that intimidation could be overcome with persistence, evidence, and community unity. The HOA cop was now facing multiple criminal charges: vandalism, harassment, impersonating law enforcement, and conspiracy, ensuring that his reign of fear would not continue. And while his threats had once cast a shadow over the neighborhood, the final showdown revealed something far more powerful: that a community united could stand against deception, abuse of power, and fear itself. Months later, the streets were quiet again, but in a good way. Children played freely, neighbors talked across fences without hesitation, and the memory of the chaos served as both a cautionary tale and a point of pride. The story of the fake HOA cop who smashed cars and terrorized a neighborhood became a shared legend, retold over barbecues, block parties, and casual conversations. It reminded everyone that vigilance, courage, and unity could overcome even the most brazen threats. And as the narrator looked out at the quiet cul-de-sac one evening, the sun setting over neat lawns and trimmed hedges, they felt a deep sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The street was theirs again. The lights of the Crown Victoria would never darken their windows at night again. And the community, scarred but stronger, had learned a lesson no one would ever forget. The war had ended. The fake cop had been exposed. Justice had been served. And the neighborhood could finally breathe again.